for coming this evening. Hello and welcome to this book launch hosted by many partners, Sydney staff and students for Palestine, and supported by Verso and the Center of Gender and Cultural Studies, University of Chile, Genocidal magazine, Spain, I'm not sure if I get the translation correctly, the Observatory of Nationalities, State University of Sierra, Brazil, and of course the Palestine Action Group here. My name is Ihab Shabak. I am a lecturer in human rights and social justice here at the University of Sydney, and I'm simply just going to be learning a lot about the history of Chile and the common struggle like everyone else here. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would like to acknowledge the continuing connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to the land, waters, and culture, and bear respect to all elders, past, present, and future, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. As we meet here today to consider the anti-imperial and indigenous solidarity in Chile and Palestine, we cannot lose sight of the importance of indigenous struggle to enable this conversation here. Yeah. So these are three links already established by just coming together here. And on a personal note, in the literature of the Palestinian liberation movement, Chile signified three things: the brutality of imperial aggression, and the brutality of reactionary dictatorship, and the third word is solidarity. Yeah. As a teenager reading the literature of the Palestinian movement, the literature of the Palestinian movement, I once came across an interview translated in Arabic with the legendary Chilean director Miguel Letin, discussing the struggle against dictatorship in Chile. In passing, Letin mentions that his father is Palestinian. I had no idea at that stage that the largest Palestinian community outside the Middle East is actually in Chile. Yeah. And which led me to do a lot of reading, research, to think about what sort of connections we could think about and establish when the Palestinian community engaged in political life both in Chile and Palestine. So what we're going to be doing today, possibly shed light on these different connections. Yeah. In this event today, 50 years on from the US-backed fascist coup of the 11th September 1973, we're going to debate the global effects of dictatorship and cage democracy based on Chile. The book we launched today, Counterrevolution and Resistance. This project integrates diverse perspective on the coup, the world's first neoliberal economy, and popular resistance to this economy, and considering the unfolding war of genocide and ethnic cleansing in Palestine, we discuss Palestinian resistance to Zionist genocide and international solidarity from Chile and beyond with the Palestinian struggle. Now, I have to mention that three people edited this massive volume, and Robert Austin Henry is with us here, Vivian Ramirez, sitting in the audience, and I'm not sure of Martinez Nivarrete. That's the third. Nivarrete is not with us, somewhere overseas.
In Mexico.
Okay, yes, in Mexico. One note to keep in mind that the proceeds of the sale of the book is going to go to support the legal case of our colleagues Nick Rima and John Keane. Okay. So, to start, we have here Clara da Costa-Reidel. We'll review both volumes. Clara is a teacher, unionist, and a socialist based in Sydney. Clara is an activist in the campaign to end Israel's genocidal war in Gaza And between 2014 and 2016, Clara lived in Chile, participating in campaigns against privatization of pension and for higher education reform. She since studied the revolutionary history and politics of Chile and writes on academic publication. This is Clara.
If I stand up, I don't know, for the recording. I just prefer to. Yeah. Is that mic on as well? Yeah. Do that. I also want to acknowledge that we're standing on Gadigal land. I think that we're talking about connections between oppressed peoples here today in Palestine, but also the indigenous people in Chile who've both suffered from colonialism and imperialism. That's the case here in Australia too, and continue to suffer from the violent repression of the capitalist state. The police across the world are terrorising Indigenous populations. I think it is important to acknowledge that for this meeting today. I wanted to start by saying that Chile 1973 to 2023, Counterrevolution and Resistance, is a vital contribution to the history of struggle from below against authoritarianism and neoliberal capitalism. The editors took a principled stand, seeking contributions from those our system tries to silence, especially when their testimony exposes the barbarity of our rulers. The inclusion of Mapuche activists currently imprisoned for resisting the theft of their land is exactly the kind of honesty a book like this demands. Marx wrote that capitalism comes into the world dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt. He could have been describing the birth of neoliberalism in Chile. Chile was made into a laboratory for reviving capitalist profits through violence, torture, murder, and the disappearances of thousands of workers and socialists who dared to imagine a society organised for human need rather than private profit. This book assembles essays and memoirs by people. This book assembles essays and memoirs by people who studied and took part in the struggle against the counter-revolutionary dictatorship and against the neoliberal orthodoxy consolidated during the transition to democracy. It challenges the official story of Chilean prosperity, bringing forward the experiences of workers and the oppressed in the neoliberal laboratory. For that, the editors deserve credit. We need more projects like this. Robert and Viviana asked me to review the book because I lived and worked in Chile about a decade ago, and because I'm a socialist and an activist. The project contains a huge range of contributions. I can't do justice to all of them here, so I'll focus on 3 themes I think are practically useful for the left today. Some chapters give sharp insights into Chile's 50 years of struggle since the coup that overthrew Allende and shattered a revolutionary movement. Others offer differing views on the present and on left strategy. All these contributions are interesting, even where I disagree, because those disagreements can matter for how we organise in the here and now. This forum is also, like Ikab said, about highlighting the connection with Palestine, given the current escalation in Israel's genocide. So I want to explore that connection too, because it speaks to the priorities of global capitalism and to the left strategy everywhere. So I just want to check before I get into it that everyone can hear me at the back okay, or to adjust the mic? Okay, awesome. So I'll cover 3 themes today. The Palestine connection to start with, Chile as a neoliberal laboratory that outlives the dictatorship, and finally the struggle against the order in that order in the 2010s and what we can learn from it. So to start with the Palestine connection, it should surprise no one that Pinochet's regime had close ties with Israel. In Volume 1, Chapter 3, Rodrigo Bolton details how, after the US Congress imposed an arms embargo in 1976, Israel became the regime's major supplier. Even after Chile's return to democracy, Carabineros continued receiving training from Israeli personnel, and trade in weapons and surveillance tech also continued. In Volume 2, Chapter 10, Pablo Joffre Leal explains why Pinochet chose Israel. He admired the Israeli army and that Israel attached no political conditions to weapons trade. Reading this, I couldn't help but think of the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz's recent comment that Israel is doing the dirty work of Western states. So whether or not Washington wanted to be seen openly backing Pinochet's brutality, it could do so indirectly through its close ally Israel. The point isn't just historical, it shows how imperial networks operate and how repression circulates across borders. In the preface, Martinelli and Austin draw parallels between Palestinian and Coup struggles for land and self-determination. The timelines and context differ, but both peoples maintain strong identities and demands for autonomy of land. In Volume 2, Chapter 7, Mapuche activist Matias Leviqueo Concha, writing from prison, describes continuing dispossession in the south. Land reforms, won before and during popular unity, were reversed under the dictatorship. The transition to democracy only accelerated dispossession through forestry corporations and hydroelectric projects. When Mapuche communities resist, they are met with police raids, ongoing states of emergency, and prison, and even death. These policies are supported by right-wing and centre-left governments alike, with equipment and training linked to Israel. I saw a small part of this while working on a forest conservation project in Biobío on Pehuenche territory. The Araucaria araucana, or the monkey puzzle tree, is a beautiful and endangered conifer central to Pehuenche culture. Pehuenche literally means people of the Pehuen, the pine nuts they gather during the spring. The community we worked with in Reserva Arauco was among the poorest in Chile. They hadn't always lived there though. They'd been displaced by a hydroelectric dam that flooded their valley. No serious compensation was even offered, just a trickle of welfare from the government that never lifted them out of poverty, but did help to entrench the despair and trauma of displacement. Forced to graze livestock to survive, they unintentionally undermined the Araucaria forest regeneration. The state treats indigenous communities as obstacles to the profits of energy and forestry firms, cornerstones of the Chilean economy. That's why the state refuses territorial demands and criminalises those who resist the neoliberal bulldozer cutting through their ancestral homelands. So what do we do with that reality? In Volume 2, Chapter 9, Isolde Reque Pailalef emphasises representation and dialogue with state institutions, contrasting that with what she refers to as the violence begets violence cycle in the South. I disagree with her conclusions. The Chilean state manages an economy that rests on the profitability of extractive corporations. No moral appeal by well-meaning representatives will overturn that. Given the state's treatment of indigenous peoples, it's understandable that some communities organise to fight back with sabotage, occupations, or direct confrontation. I think the left and socialists in particular, even though they may debate particular tactics, should stand with the Mapuche resistance, even when they're violent. At least Concha, who I mentioned above, does not harbour illusions in the very institutions that continue to dispossess this community. We should demand the release of political prisoners from Chile and in Palestine that have been jailed for resisting dispossession. The genocide in Gaza has shocked millions and shifted public opinion, despite governments trying to frame Israel as the victim. The link with indigenous struggle in Chile matters not only because the slaughter must be opposed on principle, but because it clarifies the general truth. Atrocities like these are bound up with how capitalism operates. If we want a world without ethnic cleansing and dispossession, we have to fight the system that generates it. Okay, so to move on to the neoliberal laboratory in Chile. The election of Allende and Popular Unity launched a revolutionary process. Workers defended the government against sabotage and started building an alternative power that at the point of production, cooperative, democratic, and oriented to human need. The global economy was simultaneously entering its first post-war crisis. Chile's ruling class understood that to restabilise the economy in their favour, they had to smash working class organisation and the population's hope for a better world. That was the political logic behind the coup's violence, to make the idea of mass democratic control over society unthinkable. The other aspect linked to this was economic. to replace Keynesianism with a hard free market program, particularly privatisation. In Volume 1, Chapter 8, García Lopez and Estibaliz Cuesta show how dismantling social security anchored the neoliberal restructuring. Chile's private pension system, implemented by Pinochet, has been hailed by the neoliberal centre and right, from Bolsonaro to Piñera and others, but it slashed retirement incomes and entrenched inequality. Because savings are thrown into the stock market, pensions rise and fall with speculation. During the global financial crisis, a third of funds evaporated, devastating those near retirement. Women who typically earn less and retire earlier are hit hardest. Under a public system, pensions would be equalised, but under the AFP system in Chile, inequality is locked in. Decades after the transition to democracy, the core of this system remains intact. In Volume 1, Chapter 29, Nicolas Cortis and Rodrigo Torres analysed the neoliberal transformation of education. Student federations were dissolved, university administrators replaced with military officers, and education turned into a market. Higher education became a debt trap for poor students. The centre-left governments that followed the dictatorship didn't dismantle this architecture, they deepened it, introducing co-financing that allowed public schools to charge voluntary fees, worsening class segregation, and enabling private banks to issue student loans. At the university I worked at, Universidad de Concepción, credit card vultures stalked the university campuses, preying on the poor students whose daddy can't pay for education outright and beginning a cycle of vicious debt for the rest of their lives. The outcome is obscene inequality. A tiny elite, a few families in Chile, own basically all the national wealth, while millions live in insecurity and poverty. For example, in 2019, someone on the minimum wage could be spending around 12% of their income just using public transport to get to and from work. This is the situation the neoliberal laboratory produced, and it exported it around the world. So finally, I want to talk about the struggle against this setup. Chileans didn't accept all of this quietly. Students were among the first group to regroup themselves and rebuild their organisations in the late dictatorship and in the 90s. Ortiz and Torres traced a movement arc from the 2006 Penguin Revolution of high school students, so named because they wore black and white suits to school, looked like little penguins, I think it's kind of cute, demanding funding for public education, to the 2011 demonstrations for free university and an end to the marketisation of education. Many of my Chilean friends became activists in those years, helping to bring Santiago to a standstill and confronting both the Bachelet Concepción government and the Piñera conservative government. The movement politicised society, inspiring further struggle around pension reform and state violence against women, and propelled leaders like Gabriel Boric and Camila Vallejo into formal politics. While some concessions were made, the student movement was unable to change the neoliberal education system fundamentally. Ortiz and Torres suggest that this was partly due to the movement's integration into the political system, as many of its leaders entered into institutional politics, shifting the focus of the movement from the streets into the halls of Congress. Many student participants in the mass protest distrusted this term. After decades of betrayals by the Concepción and traditional left, an anti-party sentiment had started to grow. The distrust of this shift is justified in my opinion. The movement's greatest leverage came when it mobilised en masse and disrupted the neoliberal order. Our side's power doesn't reside in a few parliamentary seats, especially when up against the right, the state, and capital. Representatives in that context tend to concede more than they gain. Even so, student power does have its limits. Unlike workers, students can't halt profits at the point of production. They can inspire and broaden people's horizons, which they did, but to confront neoliberalism decisively requires the mass industrial power of workers. For years, union leaderships tied to the centre-left parties restrained that power. But as people's economic situation worsened, pressure built beneath the surface until in October 2019 it erupted. A metro fare hike, 30 pesos, was the spark. High school students occupied stations, jumped turnstiles, and opened the gates for everyone. Within days, hundreds of thousands, workers, retirees, students, and the oppressed were in the streets, paralysing major cities. The revolt slogan said everything. It's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years. Alondra Peirano Iglesias, in the second volume, captures the moment in a beautiful description. Amid protests, assemblies, cacerolazos, and various artistic, political, and cultural activities in different territories, individual distress and powerlessness coalesced into a chaotic and overwhelming shared discontent. We recognise ourselves in an embracing and overwhelming collective force in which profound yearnings for a just society and a dignified life germinated. We became massively involved in the uncertain and astonishing political process that was unfolding. We knew and felt we had awakened. This was the most fundamental challenge to Chilean neoliberalism since the dictatorship, but it didn't deepen into a coordinated strike movement capable of toppling the Piñera regime, let alone neoliberal capitalism. There were powerful days of action and some set-piece general strikes, but the organised working class didn't fully step in to lead the struggle. In the impasse, a secret deal was hatched out behind closed doors between the parties of the left and right, including Boric and Frente Amplio, who are now in government, to channel the uprising into an institutional process to rewrite the constitution in exchange for demobilising in the streets. I agree with Ximena de la Barra in Volume 1, Chapter 17, that this was a betrayal. It set in motion a years-long process that left the neoliberal core intact and even hardened. At the time, people weren't fooled. As soon as the deal was announced, there were huge protests in the streets against it, calling bullshit on its promises for change. My friends who participated in it told me that people painted banners with the slogan, "No más pico en el ojo," block your ears, Anastasia, which means no more dick in the eye, which is Chilean slang for being conned. They even wore glasses with condoms attached to them in readiness for said dick in the eye, just to prove their point. That's the disdain that people had for the Piñera government and this kitchen cabinet deal, as it was called. But the movement lacked an alternative leadership, rooted in workplaces and neighbourhoods, capable of turning mass anger into a plan for sustained strikes, occupations, and self-organisation. The Communist Party didn't sign the original deal, but it still joined the Constitutional Convention and backed Boric's Aprueba Dignidad, even as political prisoners from the revolt remained behind bars, one of its key demands. Once again, the state's gravitational pull shifted the struggle from the streets into institutions designed to neutralise it. I think this is the deeper lesson. The capitalist state is not a neutral tool we can seize and wield for our purposes. Its function is to protect the interests of property and profit. It will not permit fundamental challenges to those interests, no matter how progressive the constitutional text is. In practice, Boric's Aprueba Dignidad coalition signalled from the outset that the new constitution would not overturn neoliberal structures, and they rejected proposals that tried. De la Barra is sharply critical of the co-optation, but stops short of drawing the strategic conclusion I think the record demands. The constitutional process wasn't just mishandled, it was a mechanism for diffusing a revolt whose power lay outside the state. We cannot reform society through a better written constitution. We should see our task as organising the force capable of challenging the state's power, the working class. What was actually needed was a leadership with a revolutionary socialist perspective that looked to building strength where our side actually has power, at the point of production. The moment in Chilean history that came closest to challenging the structures of capitalism was during the revolution in the 1970s. Workers began building alternative systems of power through the cordones industriales, which coordinated the distribution of food, goods, and ran workplaces under workers' control. They formed workers' armed defence committees and built networks to coordinate their strategy to fight the bosses. The left should look to this example. But even that was defeated. Why? Because the leadership of Allende and the Popular Unity government was fundamentally reformist, seeing the capitalist state as neutral, one that could be captured by socialists and reformed bit by bit. This perspective held back workers from developing and exercising their power to the fullest. The Chilean ruling class and its pro-capitalist backers internationally recognised the threat of workers' power and used this lack of clarity in the working class to make their decisive attack. So to conclude, the book is rich in history, rich with lessons in history. I'll start that again. The book is rich with history and lessons. It shows the capacity of the downtrodden and oppressed to rise up, to stand in solidarity, to link their struggles with those against tyranny elsewhere. It reminds us that the fight against dispossession in Waimaku is connected to the fight against genocide in Palestine, that the debt traps of neoliberal universities echo the wage theft of privatised pensions, that the police trained to repress Mapuche communities are part of the same global circuitry that arms occupations abroad. The project offers myriad takeaways for the left in our fight against capitalism today. We owe it to the courage of the Mapuche, the student radicals, the participants who faced down military violence in the October 2019 revolt, and revolutionaries in the 1970s, to raise the voices of these brave fighters and learn the lessons of their defeats so we can be better prepared for the next rounds of struggle in Chile, in Palestine, in Australia, so that next time we can defeat this rotten system for good.
Thank you, Clara, for this overview, and I believe that we will have time to engage you about questions. But now we move to Sophia Kevans will read the English original of the poem which opens Volume 1 by her poet-lorikeet father Denis Kevans, an anti-fascist poet. For over 50 years, Denis skewed abuses of power with his wit and fighting tongue. His incisive writing sounded the alarm as he illuminated painful truths about human atrocities too often concealed from public view in the frightening darkness of dogma, propaganda, and official lies. Please, Sophie.
Thank you. It's a privilege to represent my father here tonight. Thank you, Viviana and Robert, for the invitation. Robert also asked me to mention that Saturday was the 20th anniversary of my father's untimely death. It was very unexpected. He did have some heart issues which no one was aware of. But things didn't go quite as they should have in his hospital experience, and he ended up dying very unexpectedly. And given that ASIO had trailed him for years, and apparently they've got 250 metres of material on him in Canberra, sometimes I wonder, was there something more to him passing away at 66? So it's my privilege to share this poem with you called The Shroud of Santiago. And please excuse my pronunciation because I don't have a Spanish background. The Shroud of Santiago is not a pretty shroud. It is the face of Carmen Gloria Quintana. It belongs to a beautiful woman, to a beautiful compañera. The Shroud of Santiago is a shroud that you do not have to test for its authenticity, like the Shroud of Turin, which you do not have to touch with chemicals or take brush samples for examination, so that you can go to the learned doctors of the edifice built on the blood of Jesus and ask them if it is real. You do not have to do that with the Shroud of Santiago. You can walk up to Carmen Gloria Quintana. You can look deep into her eyes like the cooling lava of a volcano. You can place your hands in hers and feel the warmth flowing, fluorescent into your bones and blood. You can place your lips upon her cheek, upon her chin, upon her neck, upon her shoulders. You can taste the words the soldiers used when they anointed her. The Shroud of Santiago is easy to verify. More than 1 billion people around the world have seen the face of the beautiful woman, the beautiful compañera. Their eyes have stopped and committed to memory the externalized thoughts of crippled minds and wingless souls. You learned doctors of the church who slink in silk, who drive caddies black and ice Volvos. You learned doctors who now search for proof of the Shroud of Turin. What do you feel when Jesus' sister walks towards you wearing the Shroud of Santiago? Her eyes deep as cooling pools of volcanic lava. As she walks through flames towards you, out of the gates of hell, learned doctors of the church, learned bishops, learned cardinals, and you, whose mouths run with the condiments of peace and brotherhood and love, I do not notice you mentioning her, or the Shroud of Santiago, or the face of a beautiful woman, a beautiful compañera, who wears your shroud, Santiago, a shroud that the whole world has tested, has seen, has touched, has kissed, and has declared this is the true face of a daughter of Chile, of a sister of Jesus, and of a compañera of Che Guevara.
Sophia, thank you for sharing this beautiful poem with us. Now, Martin Martinelli, unfortunately, is absent. But we are fortunate to have Robert here, who would also talk to us about the latest volume and will allow us to know more about the work they have done to produce this volume. Thank you.
One moment, I'm from the Low-Tech History Department.
You've got a microphone there or...
Oh, this...
Yeah, this one, yeah.
Thank you for proving it. Wonderful critique, Clara. I think both of Yana and I, and certainly our comrade Gaza Martinez in Mexico, are looking forward to the published version and to addressing the very important criticisms that you make of this little project. I need to mention that Martin Martinelli has contributed magnificently during the last 5 years since its foundation to the Latin American Council of Social Sciences Research Group called Palestine and Latin America. He crisscrosses the planet. He's published 2 books now, very recently on the genocide in Gaza. In fact, his last one is called pretty well, The Genocide in Gaza. I think he's probably exhausted and has been unable to come today. So I'm a modest substitute, but I'll endeavour to pick up some of his thoughts. This little project that's being discussed today is available in only 3 sets and probably a little cheaper than you get them from Verso. However, our project today as an editorial collective is to raise funds for the defence of my wonderful colleague Nick Griemer and Professor John King, who, as most of you I'm sure would know, if not all of you, have been handpicked as the targets in the latest Zionist lawfare to try to shut us up on the question of Palestine on campus, if not beyond. So, in regards to the sale of these, the little project, a minimum of 130 but anything that you put in above that, or everything that you pay for it, whatever that happens to be, will go to the defence fund. I need to mention that we were also unable to get Edgar Martinez involved today simply because of the kind of work he does, which is largely in indigenous communities at the moment, either in Chile or Mexico. He's on the road, he's working in Chile, in Mexico, where there have been a whole spate of police assassinations recently of indigenous activists. And when he's in Chile, he works in a very similar kind of situation. He joined the editorial group about a year into our work. I have to say that considering all factors, he made an extraordinary contribution to what we have. It was he who managed to get the Mapuche leader Hector Yaitu's prologue for the book smuggled out of Concepción, a high security jail. He's rather well connected and has made a brilliant contribution all round to the project. And so, my brief contribution starts with the mention that genocides and holocausts have been very much a part of Latin American history since 1492, since the Italian mercenary Cristobal Colon was hired by the Castilian monarchy to go to Latin America and steal it and its possessions. And in the first 300 years of that occupation, 90% of the population of Latin America died at the hands of the Spanish invasion. It was stunning, to say the least. Nonetheless, resistance, rebellion and revolution have been the hallmarks of the modern post-1492 history in Latin America, and Chile is certainly no exception. So rather unlike Europe to an extent, rather unlike this country, they've been a permanent fixture, going in the 20th century, for example, from the Mexican Revolution, where more people died than in World War I, right through to the in-progress revolution, or whichever title we may choose for it, in Venezuela, and of course via Bolivia, the Bolivian Revolution, the Chilean Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Nicaraguan Revolution, from early days in the 20th century. And so, what exactly have we set out to do with this publication project? Firstly, it's a logical sequel, if you like, to our first project in 2020, which is called the Chilean Road to Socialism 50 Years On in Spanish, where we managed to assemble 60 chapters from a whole variety, a heterogeneous variety of Chilean actors, intellectuals, ex-political prisoners, current political prisoners, and to produce the two volumes with not only our guidance, but an extraordinary group of around about 80 reviewers in the space of 6 months. It was quite phenomenal, considering we were also in the pandemic, early stage of the pandemic. We had 4 years to produce this second project, and therefore a few excuses if you can find some imperfections in it, particularly on the level of proofreading, which we chose to do ourselves, by the way. It's quite common, as people who publish books will know, to find errors in the final versions, and they're irritating, to say the least. So we negotiated with Verso to keep control of the editorial process right until the very end, until it was published. So, again, many thanks to the 200 participants in this particular project. And all of the appropriate thank yous are said in the introduction, in the acknowledgements in the project. And I'd just like to finish this brief introduction with an anti-thank you, which goes to the Zionist neocon management of this university. Suffice it to paraphrase the then Dean of Economics, Professor Simpson Lee, in his foreword 50 years ago to another 2-volume, or many, in fact multiple volume project on political economy at the time. where he finishes his prologue by saying, "Those who gain enlightenment from this project cannot know what efforts were made to deprive them of it." And happy to come back to that in detail, but perhaps at tea later. So there are 2 volumes, as was mentioned, and we made a very profound attempt to ensure that they were not a hierarchy, that we didn't privilege any kind of writing over another. We laboured long hours with people who had barely made it out of primary school to put together their chapters, and they're all, in my view, wonderful contributions in a heterogeneous way. I agree with Clara's implication that we don't have to agree with the theoretical or ideological position of each of the contributors. They're from deliberately a broad spectrum of the Chilean left. But I might say, despite a few attempts, there is nothing that could be identified with the right. In particular, we set out in the invitation the statement made quite clearly that we were not going to entertain anything which promoted any kind of imperialism or colonialism, and we named Zionism. We named Zionism in the call for papers, or the call for text, if you like. The second volume opens with a wonderful essay on human rights, and in particular on the bourgeois conception of human rights. Now, more recently there's been some good scholarly work in English, but of course it's been preceded by 20 years or so of the same thing in Latin America, and in particular in Chile. And the why of that is that the non-government organisations, the NGOs, and their global reach, quite often known as the bingos, the bigger NGOs, were a plague under the dictatorship. They infiltrated very active left political organisations and successfully over time bought them off with largely Western funds. They depoliticised the working class. Now this is debatable, and I'm absolutely happy to engage on this question, but many colleagues and wonderful comrades that I've met in the last 50 years or so, since I was first in Chile in the 1970s, have said to me that at the time of the military coup, there was no better organised working class in all of Latin America, including in Cuba. That it was, despite some, certainly some pretty reasonable critiques that we can level at it for being too slow, for being, in the case of popular unity, not prepared to arm the people. And sure, there are a number of things that can be said on that level. It was nevertheless an extraordinarily militant, extraordinarily well-prepared working class, and imperialism understood this intimately and made sure that when the coup occurred, it attacked the principal popular leaders, the principal grassroots leaders, with great effectiveness, as rapidly and quickly as it could, extinguishing them, exiling them, putting them in jail, torturing them, one thing or another. So in this chapter, with which we deliberately open the second volume, takes the whole idea of human rights on in a socialist way. And in fact, it's called Socialist Human Rights. It focuses in particular on the pandemic period and what the class translation of human rights meant in terms of access to medicine, access to hospitalizations, access to modern technology, medical technology, and finds irredeemably, of course, that the West came out on top and in fact learned how to exploit it. And that was particularly true in countries like Palestine and Chile. And in Palestine it was beyond belief, the suffering that the neglect, deliberately imposed neglect, imposed. The more recent book that the two authors put out on the theme is called, I'll read it to you, I said there's several Spanish speakers in the room. It's called Derechos Humanos como Arma de Destrucción Masiva, Human Rights as a Weapon of Mass Destruction. And that theme is taken up and compressed very much in here. So this might be summarised best, I think, in the Chilean context with a little anecdote that I learned during the 90s, having been not given an opportunity to visit Chile again under the dictatorship other than the first time in 1978, where, to summarise, a father and a mother from what we call a popular suburb in Santiago, a working class suburb in the Santiago periphery, are in a very bourgeois suburb called Las Condes with their son, who's working for an NGO. He has a wonderful house. Anyone who's been to Santiago would know Las Condes. It's kind of out towards the mountains. It's an absolutely beautiful area, very green. And in the driveway there are a couple of quite recent model cars, and his father starts off saying, "Son, how is it that people in NGOs like yours are able to afford cars and houses like this?" And the answer is, well, Dad, in order to be able to fight the dictatorship, we have to be able to sleep well at night and be mobile around Santiago. And so a number of questions and answers in this session follow, and at the end the father and the mother, more or less mimicking each other, say, "Well, let's hope the dictatorship doesn't fall." All right, let me finish on this. 5 minutes?
Yeah.
I just want to mention 3 key episodes that are covered in a number of chapters and from very interesting angles in both volumes. The chapters on these 3 points actually conflict on occasions, and I think that's well, I hope we've achieved that in the book. In both volumes, we set out to get contestation, proposition, contestation, a dialectic, if you like, within the book, and a debate within the book, and we hope that spills over into the public arena in at least the Spanish-speaking world, if not beyond, when we eventually are bestowed with the several thousand we need from the University of Sydney to translate into English. Firstly, the first question I think that's critical to understand is this issue of the pact between the armed forces under Pinochet and the traditional political parties which resulted in the exit from the dictatorship via the ballot box. There was a lot of effort put in by the political right and by imperialist representatives to renovate what's called the renovated socialist perspective, which in other words made it compatible with TINA, there is no alternative, and with the emerging, in the 1980s remember, the emerging late capitalist structures on the planet, which were first implanted in Chile in 1975 when Milton Friedman went there and met with the dictatorship, and Pinochet and the dictatorship became messianic supporters of the implantation of that scheme. So first of all, if you like, there's this renovated political class, many of whom have enjoyed comfortable exiles. They become the proponents of the Washington solution as the only way out of dictatorship. But entirely ignored in this construction, I'd argue a misconstruction, is the role of international solidarity and the role of Chilean resistance, and in particular the wave of strikes and demonstrations and often lethal protests against the regime, which began in the early 1980s as the model implanted began to teeter. And I might mention, of course, that the violence in particular of the fascist forces in Chile was simply unimaginably broad and horrendous. So the people arise. One of the events that Denis Kevans' wonderful poem speaks to, not the main event, is of course the burning alive of the 2 working class Chileans, Carmen Gloria Quintana and Rodrigo Rojas. In 1986, Rodrigo Rojas dies and Carmen Quintana eventually undergoes massive reconstruction surgery in the north. This leads us to, if you like, an attempt to thread through the second volume the idea of the memoria armada, the armed memory. So we weren't looking, we didn't set out to find what's often dismissed on the more militant Chilean left as the memoria llorona, or the lachrymose memory, compilations of torture, this, that and the other. They're undoubtedly significant, but we were looking for constructions of memory which animate, which politicise and which provoke, and which embody the sense of struggle which was so well obscured, including in particular by comfortable intellectuals who often returned from their exile with their PhDs from the West and their very comfortable lifestyles, and kicked out of university positions people who'd never been able to afford some postgraduate work in Europe, the United States, or wherever. So we have, if you like, inherited this whole idea of the armed memory. It's wonderful to look at the book, which is actually entitled Memoria Armada, and see that at the funeral of Rodrigo Rojas, the police invaded, just as they do in Palestine, and steal the coffin. And there's this enormous fight, which is very well documented in the book. The second critical factor here is the upsurge in Mapuche land and resource struggles from 1990. The dictatorship corralled the whole Mapuche society into a recipient of benevolence and charity. And this had a debilitating effect there on what had begun under popular unity. What had begun under popular unity were land seizures by the Mapuche people. They had begun to take back what was their ancestral right as the First Nation of what became, in colonial terms, Chile. So this resurges, if you like. This comes back onto the agenda after 1990, and one of the leaders of that in current times, of course, is the very same Hector, who was mentioned earlier, who wrote a brilliant preface, in my view, in which he ends by comparing the struggles in Palestine and Mapuche, Chile, in Guatemala. And then the third episode is the question of how to interpret the first neoliberal uprising, the first uprising against neoliberalism on the planet in 2019, October 2019. It was an explosion of very explicit popular resentment and rejection of the neoliberal model. This was everywhere in the pamphlets, and it was exactly as Clara describes, where the students who initiated it all by jumping the turnstiles, supposedly over a 30 peso, a microscopic rise in the fares on the metro, said no, it's not about 30 pesos, it's about 30 years, the last 30 years. And that was again corralled by the paper left, if you like, by the renovated left. And it moves firstly to a debate along the lines of, well, we can fix all this by fixing the Constitution. What we need is to jettison the Pinochet 1980 Constitution, where I think 115% of the population voted. People voted from a number of cemeteries, and some of them many times, to get that Constitution off the face of the planet, replace it with a new People's Constitution. Now, the Constitution, by the way, that eventually is published after a special constitutional convention where the left actually controlled 78%. And in fact, the very existence of the Constitutional Convention was voted upon nationally, and a significant majority, I think around 66%, said yes, let's go ahead with this, let's redesign the Constitution. Then the Constitution itself is published, and it's a remarkably progressive document. Anybody who's had an opportunity to read it, there are new proposals in relation to women's rights, transsexual rights, all forms of life are re-democratised, if you like. It's a kind of extension of what popular unity had set out to do, but for a very contradictory reasons, was unable to or unwilling to achieve. But that's loaded down, and in the wash-up, most go back into their shells and accept what they've got. I'll finish briefly by talking quickly about the importance to the project of the number of, I think about 6 in all, texts on the Chile-Palestine relation. It's over 100 years old, but I wanted, Viviana and I, in fact, wanted only yesterday to update ourselves on what the current demands are. And they're taking place from the Palestinian Chilean community in a quite extraordinary time, not simply because of the genocide, but because there's been a recomposition of the Palestinian community since popular unity, where the youth of most classes have gone to the left, where they become more militant in their support of the Palestinian homeland and of Palestinian revolution, and where the bourgeois Palestinians have shrunk. They've become less and less influential and sold off a lot of their assets in the bargain. By the way, I forgot to mention that if you only get the chance to read one book on Palestinian Chile, try Weavers of Revolution, about the extraordinary Yabul factory in Santiago, which was set up in the 1940s by the Yabul of the Palestinian dynasty in originally Bolivia and then later Chile. And it tells the story from the workers' perspective, from the memory perspective, of the uprising in the Yabul factory, which led to the nationalisation of the whole transnational in that particular factory. So we asked only yesterday one of our long-term friends and comrades, a Palestinian Chilean named Nicolas Hadouan, who, like around about half of Palestinians in Chile, was actually from the Bet Jala village. What is the Palestinian Chilean community at present demanding with relation to Palestine? One, that Chile immediately cease producing parts for armaments for Israel. Two, that Chile immediately cease buying arms from Israel. Three, that Chile immediately cease exporting the ingredients for explosives to Israel. Chile has the biggest saltpeter deposits on the planet in the Atacama Desert in the north. And finally, that Chile immediately cut all relations with Israel. So there's a very, hopefully, compressed response to what's happened so far. I'm, again, extremely grateful to everybody present and everybody who's contributed, and just want to remind you of the Keen Women Defence Fund, and hope that you'll come up with $1,000 to the fund.
Thank you, Robert. I think it take us through this process of writing, editing, and tell us about this massive volume. Yeah. Of course, we would like to know more. And you, Clara, have the privilege to read and develop some critical points, and I would like to hear more about this. But first of all, let's take some questions. And I'll come to you with the mark. Okay, this is if you have a question. Or comments? Okay. Okay.
I'd like to ask more about this Memoria Armada